my thesis explores whether we can blame child soldiers for what they do in war and after war. And I argue that we should discard the binary that we seem to have between victim and perpetrator in the case of child soldiers, and instead adopt a dual victim perpetrator view. So that is that we should recognise the complexities of the experiences that child soldiers may have, the guilt that they often describe about what they feel for their actions, and the ways in which they may have been forced or manipulated. And by doing so, we can better recognise their agency. So first, I think we kind of need to understand who even is a child soldier. And international law defines a child soldier as anyone who's below the age of 18 and is associated with an armed force or armed group. So either for a state group or a militia, etc. And these are not only people who are armed in the group, but they might also be in auxiliary roles such as cooks, porters, spies, or for sexual purposes as well. And so as we can see, it's a very inclusive definition of what a child soldier is. It's maybe includes more than just the stereotype that we kind of think of a young boy holding a gun, for example, that I have on my slides. So here are some people that are considered to be child soldiers. And I first became interested in this topic because there was two cases going on when I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to do my thesis on. The first was of Dominic Ongwen, who's in the middle at the bottom, and he is a former LRA commander, and he's been tried in the ICC for war crimes, including the recruitment of children. His defence, however, is really interesting because it relied in part on the claim that because he was a former child soldier, he'd been abducted around age 8, he couldn't be responsible for anything that he did afterwards, and so he shouldn't have been tried for the crimes that he was. The second case was Shamima Begum, who travelled from London to Syria at the age of 15 to join ISIL. And I think the public reaction around Shamima Begum, especially when she was found in 2019 in a refugee camp, was really interesting because the ideas about her responsibility were really mixed. Sometimes people were suggesting that she was fully responsible for what she had done and that we shouldn't let her back in the country, etc. And others argued that she was groomed and manipulated into joining. And these cases were really interesting to me because it supposes that there is this binary of the moral responsibility of child soldiers like Shamima Begum and Dominic Ongwen, that they're either victims or perpetrators, they can't be both. But to me, that at least seems like the picture here is way more complicated, as we can see from these pictures. The kind of experiences that child soldiers may have are wide-ranging. So that's a bit why I'm kind of interested in this. But why does it matter? So currently, there are 16 states in the world that recruit armed forces, that recruit soldiers into their armed forces from the age of 16, and we are one of them in Britain. And there are also, in both armed forces and other armed groups, between 2005 and 2020, more than 93,000 children have been verified as being recruited and used in conflict. Although the number is believed to be much higher, but because of obviously the complexities of war, etc., we can't be sure of the numbers. So it seems important that given the extent of the use of child soldiers, we need to understand whether we should see them as victims or perpetrators, or the dual view that I want to propose in my thesis. So what does it mean when we say that they're morally responsible? Well, we often think about moral responsibility in the terms of the reactions we have towards others, such as praising or blaming them. So to be a morally responsible person then is typically seen in the literature as being an appropriate object of these reactive attitudes. So someone who it seems appropriate that we can say they've done wrong or they've done right. This term appropriateness, though, seems to be really vague and it needs defining. So in my research, I identify conditions which may exempt or excuse people from being morally responsible. The exemption conditions in my research are conditions which make someone not morally responsible at all. So these are things that if these are present in someone, we can't assume that they're a morally responsible agent, like we would say in philosophy talk. So I identify two conditions here. The first is that they lack moral competency. So this is that they are unable to understand moral reasons and to be moved by them. And the second is that they lack psychological complexity. And this is just a really fancy way, really, of saying that they're unable to form their own desires and act upon them. So if there was a chocolate cake, for example, they'd be unable to form a desire to eat that chocolate cake and therefore would be unable to eat the chocolate cake. I also identify some excusing conditions, and these, on the other hand, are conditions which we would usually say the person is morally responsible, but isn't morally responsible in the certain case because these conditions are present. Or we might want to say that their moral responsibility has been diminished in some way. And I've identified 5, which I think are very relevant for child soldiers, but also just in general. And these are force, so being physically forced to do something, coercion, so the threat of a force, duress. This one's a little bit more complicated, and it's kind of talking about the situation which person might find themselves in and how that's affected the choices and the decisions that they'd maybe make. Manipulation, so the classic case of brainwashing, and ignorance, maybe being ignorant to the full situation and so not knowing what the moral thing would be to do. So what does this mean for child soldiers? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it seems that we currently have a binary view that they're either morally responsible and therefore are perpetrators, or aren't morally responsible and therefore are victims. The victim view is typically held by NGOs and awareness campaigns. If anyone can remember Coney 2012, that portrayed child soldiers as victims of Coney. But the perpetrator view is also held, and quite commonly held, within communities where child soldiers may have been taken from or have left. They may not want the child soldiers to come back after war because they see them as perpetrators. But again, this seems to be assuming this binary, and the situation is obviously much more complicated than child soldiers being either a victim or perpetrator. And I think this situation is complicated in part because child soldiers often express guilt for what they have done, but it does seem right that we would blame them and see them as morally responsible, but they are, after all, children. So Ishmael Bear, who was a former child soldier, in his memoir, he recounts the way it made him feel. And he said, when people told him that it wasn't his fault. So he says, even though I had heard the phrase from every staff member, and frankly, I'd always hated it, I began that day to believe it. It didn't make me immune from the guilt that I felt for what I had done. Nonetheless, it lightened my burdensome memories and gave me the strength to talk about things. The more I spoke about my experiences, the more I began to cringe at the gruesome details. And I think this shows why the dual victim perpetrator view might be really important for child soldiers. It kind of recognises that they have done something wrong, and the guilt they feel is rational, and they can feel that guilt, but also that bad things have happened to them and they are a victim in certain ways. So why does this dual victim perpetrator view matter? In my thesis, I argue that it allows us to respect both the child soldiers' feelings of guilt, like Ishmael Bear recounts, and also the feelings of victims. If you're a victim of something horrible, you feel that the other person maybe have been responsible in some way. And I think it also allows us to acknowledge that they may have diminished responsibility in the sense that they are a victim in some ways, but are also responsible in others. And this responsibility status ultimately matters because it affects how we treat child soldiers both during and after war. For example, whether they can be punished in the case of Dominic Ongman for the things that he did after 18, or if they can be killed in war by like their adult counterparts would be able to under international law. And I argue that because of their dual status as both victim and perpetrator, child soldiers should be offered special protection in war, and they shouldn't be punished, but instead be rehabilitated through programs that focus on disarmament, demobilisation and reintegration. But these programs can't simply tell the children that it's not their fault, like in the case of Ishmael Bear. They must ultimately recognise the ways in which child soldiers feel responsible.